Hi, everybody. David Noor. I want to welcome you back to another session of Curve Benders Live. I am elated to be joined by someone I've known from a distance, admired from a distance, and the more chance we get, opportunities to discuss and ideate, the more his stock goes up with me. I want to welcome Geoff Parker from Dartmouth. Hello, Geoff.
Hey, David. Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
It's great to have you. Geoff, for those that may not know as much about you, beyond Professor of Engineering, could you briefly talk a little about your background and where you've been and what you've done and kind of your current role?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've just finished my 5th year at Dartmouth. I'm in the engineering school here, as you said, a professor of engineering. Prior to that, I was on the faculty at Tulane University in a business school for 18 years. And you might think that's remarkable, but as it turns out, I end up teaching exactly the same things in the engineering school as in the business school, because I like to live my life on the intersection of kind of technology, business, and economics. So it's just been a super fun ride so far, and we can dive into anything else you want to know.
Talk about your MIT involvement, because I know you're not only an alumni, but you're also passionate about some really interesting programs there.
Yeah, so the MIT involvement comes through the Initiative on the Digital Economy. And that's a group I've been with in its various incarnations for more than 10 years now. What's neat about that is it's a forum that brings together people from industry who are interested in sort of this increasing impact of digitization, and also academics who want to interact with people in industry. So we do a series of events. I tend to run 1 or 2 kind of sponsored research projects every year that really give us the chance to dive in and stress test our understanding of what we think we're seeing, and try to keep it real, if you will.
And when you and I met, Thinkers50 also recognized you and a colleague of yours, Marshall. So talk a little about that work.
Yeah, that was a real honor, and quite frankly, it came out of the blue. We had done work, honestly, going back into the late 90s on network effects and refining what we understood about network effects to account for more than one type and more than one side, if you will, and we can dive into what that means. And then we ended up also doing some work trying to understand when firms would find it useful to essentially harness outside actors. We call it invert the firm. But when it makes more sense to facilitate outside ecosystem actors rather than trying to do everything yourself, and try to be really thoughtful about what the conditions are under which you would want to invest in a real ecosystem facing kind of capability.
For our audience, we're live on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. I titled specifically this session, The Magnitude of the Network Effect. And it's a fascinating glimpse into some of the key ideas, key trends, key evolutions in organizational structure and strategy that Geoff and I have certainly noticed in our work with corporate clients. But let's take a step back. Geoff, obviously at Dartmouth this past year, I think many higher ed, especially in residence programs, just got, really shocked by lockdowns and lack of travel and remote learning. Talk about what the experience has been like. And I see these things as a phenomenal opportunity to test new ideas, right? We're all virtual. We figured out how to do some of these things. Talk a little about what the experience has been at Dartmouth and what have you done to test new ideas, new approaches?
Yeah, so I think everybody has kind of had this shared experience, and it's actually a little reminiscent of when I went through Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and that created this giant disruption for a cohort, but now it's international. So everybody has had this kind of shared experience. So at Dartmouth, we ended up having about a week to pivot because we're in the end of winter term, and the spring term last year was starting a week later. And it was absolutely remarkable. I mean, everybody ended up kind of going over to online, but what that meant, I think, was a pretty wide variation. And I'd say that at the engineering school in particular, we put a real emphasis on creating shared experiences for the kids, for the students, so they would still work in student teams. So there were lots of group projects, lots of breakouts, lots of things they could work on together. In terms of the mechanical engineering types of classes, we sent a big box of joy out to all the kids, and including a 3D printer. So if you needed parts, you just made them right there on the site. And so you could make all of the things that you needed to accomplish your labs. And so the idea was, well, that might support 2, 3, 4 courses, depending on what you might be enrolled in. Our lab teams and all the technologists, they killed it. I mean, it was just a tour de force of creativity and effort to get that rolled out in a week. I mean, it's just remarkable.
Do you, and that's fascinating to hear, do you believe this pandemic will have a lasting impact on higher ed and how we engage students, learners of different business acumen and kind of background in? I mean, I don't need to show up in a class to hear a lecture that I can watch on video, right? So if you're going to, in some ways, drag me into a classroom, it needs to be a little more substantive than something I could have done, online.
Yeah, so I sure hope so, David, and I'll share with you a couple of ways in which I think we've learned some things that should endure. One of them is, and again, I told you about group projects. So that's a big thing in all of my classes, and it's one of the reasons the culture at Dartmouth fit really well. So at the end of that means you have review boards. And in the past, we've every once in a while sort of been able to bring people in online, but it's always been this kind of bad hybrid experience. Now with everybody online, that experience became good. And we were able to kind of bring in a vast network. So to give an example, last spring, I teach data analytics in the spring, and we had end-of-term projects. And our ops director sent out a note to the alums because I said, "Hey Ross, I could really use some help getting review boards set up. Maybe I need about 8 people, and they could go across the various sessions." So he sent out a note. 100 alums said, "Yeah, I want to be part of that." How cool is that? And so what that tells you is that we were leaving a lot on the table, as it were, in terms of our ability to engage with a wider audience. And in this case, it's obviously one that's inclined to want to play with us, but that suggests that our sort of ability to engage is a lot higher, and the interest level is a lot higher. And so if we don't take advantage of that going forward and figure it out to be both hybrid, in person and online, then we're missing something. And that experience has been terrible in the past. So that's kind of the learning challenge for organizations, is how do you make that experience good? So if I put it, yeah.
So let's build on that. So between your work with World Economic Forum and you and I really appreciate your books, and beyond your academic focus, Dartmouth, MIT, you also work with a lot of organizations. And Geoff, I'm really interested in the trends you've observed in the last 15 plus months that you believe are actually going to have a lasting impact on organizations, on leadership, on business models. And again, there's a whole bunch of buzzwords like digital transformation. If I hear that one more time, I'm going to yawn, because you just don't know what does that mean exactly? What does that mean to you? What does that mean to your organization? So what have you observed that you believe will have a lasting impact?
Yeah, so let's be really tangible. So I did a set of interviews, and you mentioned World Economic Forum, but honestly, everything kind of converges. I actually had a really neat executive education session that I did for the Tuck School. And one of the company teams was a consumer packaged goods company. And so they talked about the explosive demand that they had for some of their products. And they were cleaning products and things that had to do with, personal protective equipment, hygiene. That's not what's important. What's important is that at the same time they were losing supply capability, they had explosive demand. And so now you have this sort of wild mismatch of supply and demand, which is never good. And so they learned pretty quickly where the weak points in their flexibility were. And a lot of those weak points had to do with qualification processes, onboarding processes. So the degree to which you can bring new participants in your supply chain, get them qualified, and then get them up and running. And so if you were to look at something that I think they would value going forward, it would be those investments they made in qualifying and ramping people up post haste. Now, they didn't care what size products were. I mean, they were just trying to ship stuff out the door. I mean, if it had to be in a jumbo size container or micro one, that wasn't relevant. What was relevant was that they maintain, quality control, but get it done quickly. And so that was a real pivot in their operating model. And we can talk about other pivots, but that was an interesting one because they overnight became much more flexible in terms of the participants in their supply chain. And
did they, I apologize for interrupting, did they make these investments pre-pandemic, or was a painful lesson they learned during the pandemic that, listen, our supply chain isn't as flexible and agile as it needs to be?
Yeah, so that was a post-pandemic, we got to get this done. And also they discovered that none of their AI predictive analytics worked. So that all got tossed out the window because all the data that they had was no longer accurate for forecasting when demand has gone to 3-4x. But you ask a really great question about pre and post investments, because other firms, and this comes out of the World Economic Forum work as well as a lot of interviews I've had with and interactions with companies, the firms that had already made kind of end-to-end digitization investments, so they had visibility throughout the chain, and that end of chain might end up on their factory floor, or if they're more of a retailer, just visibility as to who's doing what, the status, created optionality. So where things at the factory level might be completely invisible at the boardroom or at the kind of senior executive level, once supply and demand go out of balance and one market disappears but another opportunity presents itself, that's strategic. You need to know what you can do. And to the degree that firms had created those digital kind of pathways, that moved the needle. And those take years to put into place, so that's not something that you can actually do ahead of time. And I'll follow up with an example if you're interested.
Yeah, I absolutely am interested. And again, I've got a follow-up question of you. But yeah, absolutely would like.
Yeah, so I'll give you one, and it was in the ag space.
Okay.
So one of the major capital equipment makers, tractors, combines, that sort of thing, planting equipment. You remember COVID struck right at the very time we were just before North American planting season. And so this is potentially a crisis in the making. However, this particular firm had created digital twin layers. And so the idea was, hey, we can actually wire the machine up. We can do remote diagnostics and maintenance, and we can get the thing tuned up. Well, nobody wanted that, because in the prior pandemic, people liked going out to farms and interacting with their customers. They wanted to touch the equipment. And so it was viewed as kind of a loser of an investment. So they spent all this money, they got all of this stuff wired up, and it sort of sat there and blinked, which we often see with these kind of digital transformation investments. Well, come a pandemic, you can't go out. That, they would argue, made a big difference to North American planting season, as in the food that you eat today was literally made more abundant by somebody's pet digitization project a few years ago.
Mm. So one of the previous guests on the Curve Benders podcast was Sabir Chowdhury, another Thinkers50 colleague of ours that is just world-renowned for his work around Six Sigma. And my question of you is twofold. One is the discipline in reducing variance that's been around for a whole lot of years. Is that as or less so, or even more relevant when it comes to digitizing kind of a manufacturing distribution business model? The other one is systems, right? So on that ag example you gave, I read a fascinating paper on tractor trailers that are connected to the sensors in the field that tells you how much water that section's gotten, that's connected to the seeders and the plowers. And do those systems of systems suddenly become invaluable because now we've noticed that digitizing the entire ecosystem can create that sustainable differentiation for that company or that farm?
Yeah, so I'm going to take those in two parts. So I'm going to
Please.
just answer the first, and then let's come back to the second. So the question about variance, I think, is a really interesting one. And the challenge that you face in managing these systems is, do you try to reduce variability, or do you create flexibility so you can respond to the variability? And I'll give you an example, say, out of the electric power industry. So in the electric power industry, we're gradually shifting the system over to more and more renewable energy. So we've got wind, we've got solar. And the way that we currently handle the variability, obviously the sun sometimes doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow, is we keep conventional capacity. And by conventional, I mean, mostly combustion turbines, combined cycle. So think of natural gas powered generation equipment as the critical technology that allows for supply to meet demand in that industry. Okay, so that's one lever you can pull. However, you have the demand side as well. And in the past, we've treated the demand side as largely a random variable, which means, people will turn the lights on, they'll switch them off, they'll, charge their electric vehicle, they'll, run the oven, whatever, they'll run the AC in particular, or the heat, just when they'll do it, and the system has to respond to that. But of course, with better economic signals, better controls, the demand side can be just as flexible as the supply side. And so essentially we can start to engineer systems that can accommodate the variability rather than just trying to beat the variability down. I mean, the simplest systems to plan for are ones that are dead steady. But life doesn't really work that way. And so where we can create flexibility, that creates optionality. And we can create a huge amount of value with that.
I love that. Let's talk about systems of systems.
Yeah. So the ag example, I'm just super interested in that because I think it's, it's so tangible. I mean, it's literally what made civilization possible as we know it, was to settle in communities and plant and grow things, which allowed for kind of the Fertile Crescent population explosion of thousands of years ago. So it's really one of our most fundamental activities. And then you look at this data explosion, and as you said, you can monitor the amount of water that's fallen on a particular plot of land. You can monitor the seeds that you put in. You can monitor the soil composition. You can monitor any kind of nutrient or fertilizer inputs. And so what that allows you to do is to optimize to a plot by plots. And I don't know the exact dimensions, but imagine something like 10 meters by 10 meters, or 30 by 30, like 1,000 square feet roughly. So then that's pretty neat, because then you're not wasting inputs. So you can either use fewer inputs to get the same output, or you can run experiments and then get more output for the same inputs. And that notion of an experiment, if you think about the web as we know it, every time you touch a system like the one that you're watching this show on, you touch a search engine, any kind of web-based system, you're always in some kind of an A/B test. Well, that concept of A/B testing can extend to much more of the economy. And so that ag example that you just raised means that we could run experiments at scale across time and space. And so once we can collect the data, then there's no reason why 1,000 square foot plot in North Carolina shouldn't be in a test condition along with one in Oregon, Iowa, and Ohio. And that's really neat, because we can start to then think of productivity improvements at scale driven by data more in real time.
I love your comment. Do you believe that same visibility, flexibility, and optionality is as relevant to service-oriented business models as it is to manufacturing and supply chain and when we're pushing products around?
Yeah, and honestly, especially if you think about the electricity power one, that's effectively a service model because you don't get to produce ahead of time. Now, once we solve some kind of fundamental physics and chemistry challenges, we'll get better storage. But currently, the way we run those systems is much more like a service operation where you adjust capacity to meet demand. And then you hold capacity in reserve to deal with fluctuation. So I would argue that you bet it's every bit as relevant. And the degree to which we can start to shape the demand side as being part of the system and response is, really interesting, and things that we can do with real-time data.
Do you believe this pandemic has been more challenging for smaller companies to kind of overcome and realize some of the deficiencies and maybe parts of the business where they've neglected in digital investments, or larger enterprises? And if so, why?
Yeah, so I'm going to punt on being general on that, because I think that industry by industry, sector by sector, country by country, there's too much heterogeneity to give you a simple answer. So let's just talk through how people responded, and then and think about that. So I think obviously you lost some channels of access to markets, and so those companies that had already thought about being omni-channel or multi-channel, and by that, what do I mean? I mean, okay, your store is closed, but your store may as well be a warehouse. You've already invested in some sort of e-commerce or digital sort of presence to the outside world, and then you've thought about what the logistics look like to bypass having this kind of open store concept, but you have other ways to move stuff around, particularly if you're dealing in physical goods, to have supply meet demand. So it's not unique that large firms are the only ones that thought that through. Plenty of smaller operations have been wiring themselves up with back office solutions. So that's the reason I can't think that we would generalize. And plenty of larger organizations got caught a bit flat-footed and had to make some pretty painful adjustments. So I think the bigger issue is one that you mentioned early, which is, this notion of digital transformation sounds awfully generic. What does that actually mean? And that's where I would start to look. And it goes a little bit to that end-to-end digitization that I was talking about a few minutes ago. It's, have firms and organizations started thinking about their systems more horizontally so they have better visibility across the different operating units? Or have they continued to run, maintain, and invest in them as though they're verticals addressing distinct markets? Those firms that looked more horizontally and made the investments ahead of time had way more options to be responsive.
There's a lot of conversations, discussions. Even Thinkers50 has launched, the Business Ecosystem Alliance, and you and I are hearing a lot about ecosystems. Now, they've been around for a while, but it seems like this pandemic has also created a resurgence of ecosystems as strategic, as business models, as truly worthy of the leadership's both strategic thinking, but also investments. Talk about where's that coming from, your glimpse into ecosystems, why are they suddenly kind of more top of mind?
Yeah, I mean, so I think of them, since I live in that world, it's been top of mind for a long time. And I feel like there's sort of been this tide of interest.
Yeah.
But I think with the pandemic, because working with ecosystems gave you the ability to change business model and still meet customer demand, that's really important. So that becomes strategic. And so what do I mean by that? So imagine that I was running a supply chain where I had been in business for 10 years. And let's say that it was a super stable chain. So I never changed any of my suppliers. We all get along really well. Kumbaya. Okay, along comes a disruption. Now 2/3 of, or a quarter or half, just some critical parts of the system are simply offline. Can't get it done. So now I need to be flexible. So what does flexible mean? Well, flexible in this context means I need to plug in new partners. Now, I can plug them in the old way, but that might take forever in the sense that I'm going to set up long-term contracts. I'm going to go through some kind of giant qualification process. Hell, the pandemic is probably over by the time I get that done. So I've got to think differently. Well, I might then start to take parts of my supply chain and operate them more as matching markets. And then instead of simply running the system as though I was a vertically integrated enterprise, I could start to run it more as a series of business-to-business markets. And that means then participating in transaction cuts, either percentage or per, depending upon the variation in the value of each transaction, which would then start to reconfigure the whole supply chain. And it would change the business model fundamentally. Or I might just pick distinct parts off. And so take a company like Klockner. So in a couple of weeks, I'm going to do a fireside chat with their former CEO. He just, Gilbert just stepped down. And for several years, he's been essentially building a metals marketplace. And the idea there is that he'll sell, the company would sell both its own product, but also that of competitors. And you can just imagine the culture shift. It's like, wait a minute, you're literally giving our direct competitors access
to our customers
on our network that will reduce our revenue in key areas. So let me just get that straight. So that's about as big a business model shift as you can imagine. And yet it's the kind of thing that if you believe that controlling or facilitating customer kind of success, if you will, is the most critical thing you can do, then it starts to make sense.
Is that a page out of Apple's playbook? Apple kind of store and Google store playbooks where we don't have to sell it all. We just want to be a purveyor of seekers and solvers?
Maybe, but I think it's even broader than that. I think, you see all kinds of marketplaces. And it's actually a hugely interesting area for antitrust, because if you get these biggest networks, like Apple comes to mind, certainly Amazon would come to mind, the concern is that they'll self-preference. And now we don't know that that's happening, but that's always the suspicion, is that somehow the platform's own products and services will magically appear higher in search results than anyone else's.
Yeah.
And so that's an area, as I said, of pretty active antitrust scrutiny today.
The other thing you said that just took me by surprise is, you're exactly right. That CEO going to a board or going to the leadership team and saying, we're going to dramatically shift the business model. And I love your description. Wait. You're going to give our competitors access to our customers on our platform. So Geoff, other than perhaps a mental exam, what do you believe that takes? What kind of leadership traits? You and I, again, we could paint with a very broad brush and say that somebody's visionary, but specifically, what do you believe that takes to say we're no longer going to defend the status quo, we're going to challenge it?
I think that takes a combination of, kind of fear of disruption. So, the issue is, if you don't do this, somebody else might well come in with a new channel and start to pull your customers off anyway. And so there should be a healthy degree of fear that would happen. And then, of course, then there's the opportunity motive, which says, well, if we can set this up before our direct competitors do, then sure, they can sell across us, but we control that relationship. And to the degree that we can then start to roll up more services across that same network, we might actually end up growing. And so I'll give you an example now. I haven't talked to them in a couple of years, so I don't know where they are in this process, but Cemex, the giant cement company. And I think they're headquartered in Mexico, but very large company, 30 or 40 country operation. So they set up a digital fulfillment system. The first time I looked at it, they had like 10,000 users. It was 35,000. So not huge, but I mean, these are big systems. Okay, so you'd say, well, what's cool about that? Well, at one level, think about cement. It's an interesting commodity because it's actually quite differentiated by temperature and conditions. So the chemistry needs to be relatively unique, and it needs to get to the right place at the right time. So if you can start to aggregate data with weather forecast information, with traffic information, you can be considerably more responsive, and you can waste less material. So the logic for doing that, again, that end-to-end digitization, digital visibility that has been a theme today, made perfect sense. So that saves you on the operating cost side. A lot of firms just stop there. They're like, great, I can do the same with less, or I can do more with the same. But the real opportunity is, okay, now you just laid in the infrastructure to build a market. There's nothing so special about cement. Once you have that customer relationship, buildings are complex systems, and they have large bills of materials of stuff, stone and steel and wiring and other commodities that need to show up. And you may have the best data on that project management system. And so you might actually be able to start to sell, especially more fragmented markets that are more specialized, across your network. There's your opportunity.
So the fear could also be, again, rocking a boat on our existing business model, our existing relationships, our existing supply chain, and kind of how, if I do that digitally, do I still need a sales force, right? If I do that digitally,
and so you actually just hit the key issue, which is the channel conflict. Because I didn't really answer your kind of what do you have to deal with as the senior management. And part of the job there is to manage the channel conflict. Because that your national accounts manager, your highly compensated, super skilled sales force that's good at doing business one way, has zero interest in a self-serve model where customers potentially don't talk to anybody. They might just interact with a site, or if they're higher volume, there might just be some sort of API, application programming interface connection, and they just wire the systems together. Boom. That's disruptive.
That channel conflict just creates friction, right? And
I have yet to see an organization that has invested in sort of multi-channel and frankly just digitization in general that doesn't get channel conflict as a byproduct. Haven't every system I've seen.
And it's unfortunately one of those legacy baggages that tend to kind of well, we've always sold direct, or we've always sold through distributors. What do you mean we're going to abandon?
And that's, if you go back to some of the things you talked about with the pandemic, that's where the pandemic actually created opportunities, which was to run all of those experiments out of necessity. And then you got a chance for many organizations, if they were creative, to then be able to do that without the blowback.
So we got a great question from our audience, but before we get there, for those that may not be as familiar with the term, describe the network effect at a high level. What is it, and why would a P&L leader care?
Yeah, so if you think about the value to a user for consuming a product or a service, the way we think about a traditional product is that it's all the value is kind of embodied in what I deliver. And so, for example, if I, have a bowl of cereal or, oatmeal, that doesn't have a whole lot of network effect value. I don't care if you consume eggs or oatmeal or cereal or orange juice. That doesn't affect my value for that product. Much of the economy operates on that kind of idea, that we can deliver a product or service. Its valuation to any one user is unique to them. Lots of other things, on the other hand, have a network effect. And what that means is that part of the value of the product or service is tied up in the number of other users who are on that system, who consume that product or service or make use of it or supply on it. Probably one of the simplest examples is go back to the old operating system days, Windows and Mac, or currently sort of iOS and Android. If all of the thing that was in like my little hand device here, if all of the functionality was delivered when they sent me that little shiny object, then I wouldn't care so much about the developer side. And if I never wanted to talk to anyone, then I wouldn't really care about the user side if I never wanted to message anyone. But as it turns out, I actually do care about the developer side, and they provide services, products, apps, connections to things that vastly increase the value of this system to me. And similarly, and so that's sort of like the ecosystem and users who aren't like me. And so we'll call that a cross-site network effect. And so to the extent that they capture a set of providers who can extend functionality, provide interesting products and services, I'll want to affiliate with that system because it raises the value to me. Similarly, I may want to interact with people like me, other consumers. And the systems that facilitate consumer-to-consumer interaction also create value. And so rather than just sitting there blinking, this particular system is very much of a network effect system. And that network effect is both same side, people like me, and cross side, giving me access to different types of suppliers, providers, users.
So the question from a LinkedIn user is, what are some of the different ways in which network effects break down?
Yeah, so, and by that, I think you mean, how do you blow network effects up?
Yeah. How do they fail? How do they fall?
Yeah, one of the ways they fail, so they fail in a few important ways. One is that you end up having poor quality, and so you end up driving users off a system. And so, for example, if I come to, let's just think of a marketplace, and the marketplace allows any seller on, and those sellers defraud me. Now I'm like, that didn't go so great. I lost my money. They didn't do what they said they would. They sent me something. It was junk. It was a counterfeit. So now all of a sudden, I'm less interested in going to that marketplace. And so what they've done is they've destroyed network effects. And because they didn't do the filtering, the quality control, the governance, they actually allowed a bad actor onto the system, then that created a negative network effect and reduced my overall value for affiliating with it. And so that becomes a really important management kind of function. It says, if the reason that people come to this system is because of the network effects, I better have some management processes that take a long, hard look at network effects and manage them explicitly as a valuable part of the system.
Okay, love that one. You said there's several. So poor quality is one. What's next?
Well, so on the flip side, okay, so poor quality on the provider side is one, but also just the core system. So imagine that you've got a system and then system B comes along. System B has done better engineering, and so they've made it easier and less friction to affiliate with, and I can do more things with it. So now all of a sudden, I can start to pull users off of system A and pull them over to system B. And so if that happens, system A could end up in a spiral. So if they start bleeding users, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because fewer users, less value, then more users leave, less value, more users leave. You think about these flywheels, people like to talk about that. They always think of the positive side. You know, more gets more gets more. Well, it goes just as quickly in reverse. Less gets less gets less.
You mentioned users like me, as well as those that are not like me. I think it's single or multi-sided. Talk about the difference between those. And again, if I'm looking to learn some lessons from this pandemic, and I want to test, I want to explore, I want to pilot an ecosystem, I want to pilot a network effect business model. What am I evaluating and delineating one versus the other?
Yeah, so let's break that down into two. So when I talk about users like me, I'm qualitatively different than an advertiser. So somebody mentioned on LinkedIn. So if you think about LinkedIn, users like me are other professionals. And so we want to interact with one another. Great. And to the extent that there are more professionals that I can interact with, that creates value in the system. That's a positive network effect. If I care about the advertising, it's either not very big or much value to me, or it might be slightly negative. But the advertisers want to get access to me, so they care hugely. And so the network effects can be positive or negative, depending on the type of interaction. So, okay. I just wanted to be clear on different types of users. And then a third type of user in that system might be a publisher. They want to put out content. This is content, so we're acting in publisher mode right now. Another type would be some sort of service offering, where they might do some analytics for you or actual software or something. So that would be like an ecosystem developer type of user. And I want to talk about them as users more than buyers or sellers. Buyers or sellers is a pretty narrow distinction, but a lot of these systems are multi-sided platforms. And so the users come in different buckets, and they have different meanings in the way that they create network effects for one another. And their valuations, the utility, the value that they get from affiliating with the system is this kind of complex function of dependencies of the number of different types of actors.
I'm reminded of LinkedIn. Geoff, you're going to chuckle, and I'm going to date myself for some of our audience members. I think when I first joined LinkedIn, it was like 3,000 users, right? So obviously,
you were way ahead of your time.
It's a story of my life. And now several hundred million users. And I distinctly remember LinkedIn bought like lynda.com for that training kind of functionality. Is it a normal evolution of a network effect, of an ecosystem, to, just like we've done with M&A for years, shore up either other functionality value add for its user base, and or let's go the other way, divest something that says, hey, we think it's cool, but it's clearly not of value to my market. I'm going to spin this off as a separate either niche play or something else that's going to be of interest and value to somebody else. Are you seeing examples of both?
So the first, I think, is more common, where you try to essentially either harness an ecosystem that can create kind of long tail content and be products or services. So you don't want to necessarily provide it yourself, but you want somebody to be able to provide it across your network, get access to your user base. So that's pretty common. And every single sort of big network system, we could, Apple, Microsoft, LinkedIn, Amazon, Google, you name it, we could find examples. I think the second thing you said is really interesting, which is, when do we start to divest? And I guess I would say when it's either supplied by enough ecosystem partners that you don't have to control it yourself, you might spin it out or just stop doing it, confident that the ecosystem essentially will provide. So let's give a tangible example. I think we're in this interesting case of electric vehicles. And so there's one company that chose to internalize the investment in a major way for fast chargers. And so that was one choice that they made. And then most other companies were traditional automakers, chose to depend upon kind of the existing type of system, which is some third party will come in, they'll provide the network, and then we'll be able to use that. So you'd say, well, which one is right? And I'd flip back and say, it's not which one is right, it's when is which one right. and that gets to that temporal question that you asked about when do you divest things.
So it sounds like early on, if I want to really build out the viability, the scalability of my EVs, the chargers, I don't remember them being that prevalent. So early on, it seems like you had to build the infrastructure to make your product sufficiently valuable.
You would think that seems pretty clear, and yet Tesla got a 10-year head start to do that all by themselves. So, and it was, for them, it was an enormous investment, billions, but for the incumbent automakers, they can spend that kind of money on one or two models. So it's a bit perplexing that kind of long multi-year runway was given. And so they control the critical complement. So of course they don't allow other firms to get access to the network. They invested in it. And so that increases the value of the car. Now, of course, most charging is done at home, but if you want to go more than 300 miles or 200 miles, then you need a network.
Stations.
And so early on at launch, yeah, it made all the sense in the world to internalize in that. But then you said something interesting, which is, when do you divest? And of course, the answer on that one is eventually there will be a nationwide system of gas stations. Oh, wait a minute. That was 100 years ago. Same idea, though.
Yeah.
Eventually, there will be fast charging networks, and the companies themselves won't have to control those. And then the advantage to Tesla of maintaining that system and continuing to refresh and investment in it will disappear. And so they either open it up to other companies or just divest it.
I want to go to a LinkedIn user for another question, and then I want to ask you a follow-up question. So can you give us some examples of indirect network effects and or impacts?
So when I talked about different types of users, that's an indirect network effect. So when we think about, I value a system for the ecosystem of developers or content providers or people not like me as a consumer, that's an indirect network effect. When I value a system for access to consumers, users like me, that's a direct network effect. So in the LinkedIn context, the direct network effect is a function of the size of the professional user base. The indirect network effect comes from content, applications, maybe negative advertising.
For our audience, if you join us late, you're listening to Geoff Parker, professor of engineering at Dartmouth College and also an MIT research fellow in the digital economy and the platform industry research studies. Geoff, talking about Tesla and the chargers, you brought up when, and I'm curious, I want to build on that specific example, batteries. Yep. Batteries may not necessarily be my core competency, but it's critical to my value. So are you a proponent of, don't try to do it all myself. Let me go partner with, let me go OEM that from somebody and integrate my value, number one. Number two, I'm fascinated by Tesla's now extension into the power pack in my garage and solar tiles. And I think they're borrowing a page from Jeff Bezos. I forget razors and razor blades. I'm going to sell you a razor and make money on groceries. So
let's unpack. I think some of it is the same effect that you've got with the with the EV charging infrastructure. If it doesn't exist, you'll often see an organization have to vertically integrate or at least partner to control. And by that partner to control, think about the way that Apple has controlled a lot of the component access for things like its iPhone and iPads. They actually were really good at locking down critical components. Think screens, processors, memory chips, battery technology, even if they didn't make it themselves. And so in times of high demand, they were able to supply when others had a real challenge there. So I think now in the ramp up to EVs, having really good partnerships or potentially having to make direct investments, as we've seen in like these gigafactories, makes sense. But roll forward 20 years, this technology becomes a lot more mature. Then does any one automaker really need to control that? No, I can't. I don't see much advantage left in it. The sort of locus of competition is going to shift to some other space. And so that's that temporal nature.
Yeah, talk about battery packs and solar tile.
Oh yeah, isn't that cool? And I, as somebody that's, I think I'm on the wait list to get a couple of those Tesla battery packs in my garage. They're running some sort of a trial. That one's interesting to me. I have to believe that there's enough demand on the EV side for the next decade or two that you could sell all of the supply. So, where does that make sense? It probably has to do with starting to build a more continuous customer relationship. So if you think about the difference, say, between your bank and your insurance company, they're both financial services companies. They both can have really nice apps. One of them you're likely to check every day, and one of them you might check a couple times a year. And I pretty much don't have to tell you which is which. So one of them is in an automatically better position to have an ongoing customer relationship, understand your needs, and then figure out with predictive analytics, when to offer you things that are appropriate at that moment. Don't offer me a mortgage 2 months after I bought a house and had a mortgage. That's sort of silly. But maybe, in a year I'll need a home equity loan to do, to build out an addition type of thing. So then now let's sort of back into the Tesla idea. That would give another customer interaction point that would start to give you fine-grained data on what's happening at that home. And so you'd have good ideas on the charge patterns. And then you can start to offer different products and services around EV. Do I think that's a huge profit pool? Not necessarily. But do I think there's a logic there and I can kind of understand it? Yeah.
One of my more recent guests was Michael Watkins of the First 90 Day fame. And Geoff, I love practical, pragmatic, actionable insights. So I'm a P&L leader of a mature company in a mature industry. I'll let you pick. It could be insurance, it could be CPG, it could be manufacturing, it could be professional services. I am concerned about our status quo. I'm concerned that we're not going to learn anything out of this pandemic, and we're just going to try to go back to business as usual. How would you give me a roadmap? Give me, as an advisor, top 3 things, 5 things I should go look at, go explore, to really look at ecosystems, to really look at that shift in business model, that fundamental fear, that sinking feeling that if we don't disrupt ourselves, somebody else is going to disrupt us. And this is the time, this is the opportunity, this is the impetus. As Gary Hamel talks about, strategy isn't some calendar-driven anything. It's an opportunity to look at the world in a completely new way. Give me that roadmap of the 3 to 5 things you would recommend me to go explore.
So I think you kind of gave the impetus already. So let's actually take that as a given and say, look, I buy that the world's changed. I can see that the firms that have grown, 10 times faster than me are all really good at managing data and managing interactions with customers at scale. Okay, and so far they haven't entered my market. My market might be healthcare, it might be manufacturing. Let's just set that aside, or financial services. What's more important is I'm paranoid. So now I'm paranoid. You got my attention. Great. Well, what does that mean for Monday morning? Well, Monday morning, if you wanted to plug in and have a seamless customer experience or a seamless ecosystem experience, and you wanted visibility across the system, can you do that? Well, no, most firms can't do that. Okay, why? Well, because the way that I grew up was I built systems to power my vertical P&Ls. Okay, and that made sense. But now we're in a different world. We're in a world where you pretty much have to be cloud because you need to be seamlessly present everywhere. And the economics are better on that for a variety of reasons. Now what do I do? Well, if you tell me I have to do that migration, you're telling me I have to double invest because I'm going to have to run my legacy while I'm also trying to figure out how to take advantage of this new technology. So now all of a sudden I'm in a very interesting conversation with the board. And I'm in a very interesting conversation with the P&L leaders because I'm taxing the P&L leaders if I'm at the C-suite saying, hey, guess what? I'm going to hit you for both your legacy tech plus my cloud migration strategy. And you lucky you get the opportunity to pay for both. Tough conversation. And then they say, well, I don't want to do that. In fact, I like my legacy tech because it does everything I want to do. And then you come back and say, sure, but here are 6 new products and services that are already out there in the marketplace provided, say, by the fintechs or this tech startup. Can you do that? And they're like, sure, I could do that. It would take me X engineering dollars and, Y number of months. And I say, well, guess what? You get 1/10 of that. Can you do that with 1/10 of those resources? Well, no, of course not. That's because you haven't invested in the infrastructure layer that can power these unique solutions at scale. And that's where the kind of competition is going to shift to, is how fast can I sense new products, services, and demands, and then address those given my systems and infrastructure. And if I can't do those fast and relatively cheaply, then I probably have the wrong infrastructure.
So you're really are pushing my opportunity cost buttons of how will I remain relevant in this stage where, as you said, those that have been able to scale their data, but also the customer interactions are gonna be dramatically better off than their peers.
Yeah, and that should be very worrisome.
Got it.
And then in terms of how do you get there? Well, that's a whole separate set of conversations around how do you work with your leadership teams and, how do you get the justifications to make these kind of strategic infrastructure bets? But that's, we'll have to spend another hour on that.
So the last book was Platform Revolution. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So I'm curious, what's top of mind? What's the next book?
So interestingly, we just signed a deal to do the 2nd edition. And you might say, hey, didn't you guys already write Platform Revolution? And you say, well, yeah, but that was 5 years ago. And we did a lot of the writing 6 years ago, and the world has changed dramatically. So we're going to probably refresh about 2/3 of the content. So for example, the world of regulation couldn't be more different in 2021, 2022 than it was in 2015, 2016. And we've done a lot of work with the European Commission, helping with the Digital Markets Act. And so we'll be able to bring that work in. B2B has exploded. And we barely touched upon it. And in fact, one of the criticisms of Platform Revolution was that it's primarily a B2C book. And we agree. However, through the World Economic Forum and our projects with our research sponsors at MIT and others, we now have quite a bit of new information and data and cases. And that'll be a whole new chapter and kind of a how-to. So those are just a couple. And then you mentioned network effects. I think that we've learned a lot more about network effects, and they're a lot more nuanced. So we're going to completely rewrite that chapter. So very excited about that. So that's what's upcoming.
I love it. Can't wait. For our audience, if you've missed that conversation, you've been listening to Geoff Parker, professor of engineering at Dartmouth College, research fellow at MIT's Initiative for Digital Economy, Thinkers50 recipient, World Economic Forum involvement, and just an all-around nice guy. So, Geoff, thanks for taking the time to be our guest on Curvebenders Live today.
David, thank you so much for having me here, and thank everyone for joining us. It's been great.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.